Hey, good morning everyone, TractorMan44 here. I'm sure that you guys all have your own solutions to your tomatoes once they get to a height to where they're above your tomato baskets. But if you don't do something with them whenever they get this height, what will happen is they'll continue growing, then the weight of the branches plus the fruit will go ahead and pull them over the top, and they'll actually not really break off, but they'll crimp every one of the stems right at the height of the top basket, and those things will just drop down, and it'll stifle the flow of the nutrients and stuff getting to the fruit, and so your product is somewhat diminished. So you have to do something in order to sustain this growth in a controlled manner above this. Now what I do is I take 8-foot pieces of whatever happens to be available, and I go ahead and rip them into 2x2s or whatever is a convenient size, and I'll go ahead and drive them into the ground very, very deeply, because once again, as these tomatoes grow, the weight is going to be concentrated on this side or that side, and it's going to want to pull the entire basket to the left or to the right, and in some cases, whenever they get like that, high winds can just blow your baskets over. You come out in the morning and your tomatoes bent over or crimped really close to the ground, and your basket's in a tumble right into the next basket. This minimizes that from happening. Now, whenever you tie these off, there's two things to remember. You can always use baler twine, but because of the abrasive nature of that baler twine, what happens whenever the wind is blowing back and forth, the stems will continually working against that baler twine, and the baler twine will have a tendency to damage the stem, and in some cases it literally saws all the way through them, depending on the type of twine that you use. Now this is like a Kodak twine here. I think it's recycled film or something like that, some kind of a material. But the old actual fiber twine was so rough and abrasive that you would definitely damage your plants. So what we've been doing for years is we take the rag option. We go ahead and rip rags into whatever lengths we need, because the rag is mostly a cotton base. That's what I like to use, and it's nice and soft, and once you tie those up loosely, then the wind blowing back and forth doesn't do the damage, have the sawing effect on the actual stems. The worst thing you can do is have a pole that's 8 feet long and have too small of a hammer, because all you'll do is mushroom the end of your post or your pole. But then the next worst thing you can do is use a full-size hammer with a very long handle, because that's going to become an obstruction and be much more difficult for you to use. So I like to use this with a little homemade, really short-handled 8-pound head sledgehammer. This one looks like it's going to want to be leaning this way because the majority of the stems is to this side here. So I'm going to go on the uphill side for this stake and ferret it right down in between there. Now you're ready to go. It doesn't necessarily have to be perfectly straight, but it does make your garden neater. The key is to tie them snugly but loosely, because if you tie them too tight, you're going to do the same thing that you're trying to avoid. And in some cases I'll take something like this and bind these together, and then pull the series of 3 stems over and then tie it individually. And then every couple of days you always keep an eye on your plants, and you come back and you tie them again and possibly again. And if they get above 7 feet high, you kind of figured that they wanted to get there, and so just let them go, and then they'll kind of fall over at the top. You can still go farther if you want. You can actually do like I've got with the sweet peas and actually put a ridge pole across the top, and you could literally tie those and let them grow along the ridge poles and overlap each other, and then you actually have hanging fruit, from the bottom of the poles. But that's only in extreme cases. I forgot to point out, you can take your hatchet or a skill saw and go ahead and sharpen these into a point. That'll make it a whole lot easier to drive in. Again, I like to tie them firmly but loosely with the square knot. If you're going to use this technique or something similar to it, you want to do it fairly early, a little bit earlier than what I've got here, simply because I've got so many blooms on these tomatoes and so many fruit already being formed, that the jarring of the sledgehammer sometimes transfers to the cage, and it'll shake, and it may knock some of your buds off or your flowers off, and it may knock off some of your forming fruit. So you want to do it just a little bit earlier than whatever I'm doing. No matter what time you do it, it's better than not, because it'll definitely save a lot of the plant life, and you'll get much more production out of them in the long run. And you want those driven down good into the soil below your topsoil, just to make sure that they don't actually fall out, because there will be an immense amount of weight or pressure on them before the season is over. Well, as you can see in the background, we have all the tomato plants that I'm going to stake. They're all staked now. So all we have to do now is wait for them to grow a little bit and tie them off. And if you look behind me, you can see the sweet peas. Mistakenly, I thought this was a brand that would actually climb my poles. They're not. I think they'll climb strings. And if I use this brand next year, what I'll do is stretch strings instead of poles. But you can see I use the same technique, tying them exceptionally loose, just on the poles, just to let everything grow right up in between and not chafe with the breeze as the wind blows the plant back and forth. Minimizes that chafing on the stem. Got a ton of blooms on them, and every one of them you can see a sweet pea forming inside there. So everything is looking really good. And of course we had a real good rain. You can see how moist the ground is throughout, and the rain plays havoc on these bush beans. But you can see they're doing very, very well, and there's just literally tons of blooms, and there's literally a ton of little bitty beans forming. So we're looking in pretty good shape. Well guys, that's it for this one. This is just a little garden update, number one, and number two, a little bit of a tip on how I do tomatoes. One of literally a myriad of ways of staking and tying the tomatoes. Years ago, we just let them grow on the ground, sprinkle straw all around, and then as they would grow, gently pick them up and let them lay on top of the straw, you know, as the plants grew and then kind of bent over. And that was actually very aggravating, because the terrapins just wreaked havoc on the tomatoes, you know, that close to the ground, or literally laying on the ground in that bed of straw. So then we started staking them only with stakes and tying them with baler twine. That's when we learned the issue the baler twine has with the stems of the tomatoes. So then we graduated to the rags and everything, and that's really pretty cool. You just in the fall you can just burn the rags right along with the dead stuff, you know, in your garden, you know, in preparation for next year. Like I said, that's the end of this one here. Hope y'all enjoyed that. And this is Tractor Man 44, and I'm out of here, guys.